this trouble about 11 o'clock, after which there was a ballpark here, baseball park here by the name of McNulty Baseball Park, and quite a few Negroes went to this place, to McNulty Park, and after a while, my mother worked for some people, white people, and they came and they asked for us, they got us out of this ballpark, and we lived with them for a while until we rebuilt a home.
So what did you actually see of the riot? You were out of the area by the time your house was actually built?
Yes, we were out, we stopped at one of our men, one of our prominent doctors' home, Dr. Key, and we stayed there until the militias came for us. But after we came back, after we were released, we found out that our home was totally destroyed. Everything was destroyed.
You can't heal from what you don't know.
Right.
It's still there in your psyche. But if you don't release it and grapple with it and acknowledge it, it's not going to let you go.
Right.
Who lived in Oklahoma originally? It was the Native Americans.
Native Americans, yeah.
So then they got this idea called the Trail of Tears, and they moved everybody to Oklahoma because they thought that's where the Native Americans were supposed to live. And with them at that time were a lot of freed slaves who also were on the Trail of Tears and then were incorporated into the Indian tribes when they got to Oklahoma. Oklahoma became the reservation. But then the next thing that happened was there was this thing where they had these territories for settlement that they opened up, the land boom. And so all the pioneers ran to Oklahoma to grab a piece of land so they'd have a place to live, right?
Right.
And a lot of those pioneers were freed Black people. So it turned out that of the 50 all-Black towns in the country, 30 of them were in Oklahoma.
Wow.
It was a very good place for Black people. The land opened up, and they went and staked their claim, and they built what they thought was a safe place to live.
Self-sufficient, independent place. From Mother Bird.
Isn't that interesting that that would be an opposition chart? Right. So in fact, the mother bird was giving them the place to build a nest.
Mm-hmm.
But then when they became self-sufficient, that was a little upsetting.
That was when the problem happened. So ultimately, another keyword for Pluto is jealousy. It seems to me like jealousy has played a major, role in a lot of the history of the United States, as a country, and we see it here on the outside of this wheel in relation to other cities and some other countries and territories. Jealousy seems to be a big factor, and we are the superpower. There cannot be a superpower outside of us. So.
Right, both in terms of our identity as a country and also our identity as a people.
Yeah.
So then there was the First World War, and W.D. Du Bois said to Black people, join the war effort, contribute to your country and support it. So they did. 600,000, some huge number of Black men went and joined the armed forces and fought for their country, side by side, white soldiers, and as much as that were possible, felt equal treatment. And in Europe, they didn't have the kind of race bias that we did. And so when they were living in Europe, they were treated just like anybody else.
Yeah, like human beings.
And they kind of got used to that. So when the war was over, they came back to the States, and everybody welcomed the war heroes unless they were black. And this is where all of a sudden, while during the war and in Europe, the black soldiers that had participated had evolved in their own self-identity. And the people at home had not made that evolution because nothing
Wow.
changed for them.
And there we have it again. Travel and expansion, breaking the barriers of ignorance.
Yeah.
And we see this in the tier of Saturn and Moon.
Well, that Saturn conjunct the Moon thing
Yeah.
is a rather significant aspect, I think, also.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when the black soldiers came home and everybody was welcoming the soldiers and now giving them jobs and homes, and the people at home were a little disturbed that the soldiers that were black wanted the same treatment as the soldiers that were white.
Wow.
And for the first time in the history of this country, the black people stood up and defended themselves. They put on their uniforms and stood their ground. It said, I earned my time. I spent my time for the country. Now the country needs to support me.
It's time
And
to pay up.
that had never happened before in this country, that black people would take a stand like that. So it was essentially the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Greenwood is growing again, just as it was in the teens. Around 1912, John Williams, the first black Tulsan to own an automobile, built a 3-story structure that sparked the beginning of Tulsa's Black Wall Street, Greenwood Avenue. Rebuilt in 1922, this is as the structure exists today. Just as Wall Street has always been more than just a street, so has Greenwood. Soon the prosperity of the business district spread to the surrounding neighborhoods. More and more fine structures were built, including the magnificent Mount Zion Church, completed in 1921, with the congregation moving in April 4th of that year. Estimates of the cost of what was then, without question, North Tulsa's newest and best church cost its congregation a total of $92,000 and took 5 years to build. Less than 3 months after the congregation moved in, the structure was burned to the ground, a casualty of the Tulsa riot of 1921.
So as we see here, in contrast, to bring this back to the astrology of it all, the U.S. chart on the outside aspecting the Tulsa, Oklahoma City chart on the inside. How does the USA interact with, engage with, have relation with Tulsa, Oklahoma specifically, this melting pot central location for freed black people that are thriving and gaining status and wealth and, you know, essentially,
Finally getting the American dream that
yeah,
supposedly people in this country can have access to.
the false reality, as we can see with the Neptune conjunct the Mars here.
Oh, and the whole opposition. I mean,
Yeah.
how could that ever happen when you have sun opposition sun?
Right,
It's like a teeter totter. One is up and the other one is down.
right. That, I think of Mars as where we take our action, and it seems as though the Neptune of Tulsa sort of reminding us of where the US's words weren't really matching up because Mercury, Mars and Mercury, the words and the action weren't matching up, and dissolving that. And so they probably were promises, I imagine, to these black soldiers, and that were not upheld
Yes,
prior to their enlistment into the armed forces.
absolutely.
All right. So I want to kind of get into now why this particular project. And so here's the fun part. I'm going to stop the share for a second. We're still recording. Okay, all this is going to be edited. I wanted to hear from you, Mai, and this is something that you've held on to for a long time. You've had footage for many years of an interview that you did with Tulsa riots. What is happening in your life right now? What transit? What's going on that's got you suddenly digging into your basement?
Well, you have Mars on my midheaven.
That's that's right. I'm kind of cracking the whip and
Yeah.
forcing you to work. And so the thing we share is your midheaven is at 22 Capricorn. My Mars is at 22 Capricorn. Pluto in transit, the Saturn in transit that just happened, the Great Conjunction. We're both
All exactly in that position.
exactly in that position. And this kind of made me go, would you be interested in, me interviewing you on this footage that you have, this gem, this gold mine? I kept on seeing article after article of the last known Tulsa survivor is no longer living. And then more recently,
How did you know about it? About that footage?
Well, I knew about the footage through talking to you, but then more recently there was that documentary.
Did you see it when you were here? Did I ever show it to you? I did.
Yeah, you did show it to me and it must have been the first time Pluto hit or was in aspect to that Mars of mine. But also this more recent, what is that new show that's on Netflix now or Hulu?
The Watchmen?
The Watchmen came out and everyone's talking. The buzz is going about what is the Tulsa riot? What's going on? And, things coming out of it.
And more recently, they discovered possible mass graves.
Yeah, based on the density of the soil and different things like that. And I went, okay, something is pulling me, urging me. Pluto must be tugging at me. Pluto is it's like a magnet under the ground with, under your own sort of ground of complacency that forces you to work. And so this is kind of making me go, I've got to see if Mai would be open to this. And so let's kind of say it's like,
and not only that, but you have your Mercury at the top of your chart.
Yeah, the
message. Mercury is
on your midheaven,
and your Mercury falls at the midpoint between my Saturn and my Neptune in my chart. Mm-hmm. And they're far enough apart that they don't really act at the same time normally. But when your Mercury is applied to that, your Mercury is close enough to both of them to get them to act. So if Saturn isn't work and film isn't Neptune, I don't know what is.
There you go. I remember when you told me about the film that you had, and I was just kind of like, I gotta see this. And I think you'd like found someone who could convert 8-inch tape at the time to DVD, and you were able to salvage.
I started talking about it and didn't even know if it even still had not decomposed.
Yeah, so you had to go pull it out of wherever it was amongst your things. And so when you did, how much of your footage were you able to salvage?
Well, it looks like most of the footage of the interview got salvaged. It looks like the actual video project that I did and the parts where the narrator's talking did not.
Wow. And more so, it's sort of like the sort of ghost from the past, in that the person you interviewed in the footage, or persons, was it, I believe?
One person
is no longer living. You were able to actually contact the church to confirm that.
I have no idea how I can't even remember.
Yeah.
How did you first know about the riot?
Well, that night we were having our graduation play about 9 o'clock, and after we had our exercises, when we came out of the building, we were told then that trouble was brewing uptown because something that happened early during the day.
Okay, and what happened to you during the riot?
Well, I was with my parents. I stayed with my parents all during this violence and this trouble, and we stayed together. And we moved during this riot, during the trouble. We moved further north, out of the way of much trouble, if you could see, if possible.
Outdoors?
Pardon?
Outdoors? You were outside?
Oh yes, we were. Yes, the next morning, June the 1st. This happened at that night in May, the 29th or 30th, I think it was. Then the next day, that's when people began to move northward.
To houses? Or?
Yes, to safety overall.
So,
yeah.
You were in your house that night, you stayed in the house that night, and then in the morning,
Yes.
you left the house?
Early that morning, 5 or 6 o'clock that morning, we began, as I said this a while ago, we knew that something was brewing, trouble was brewing, and my family, all of them went home, and we went to bed, but early the next morning, about 5 or 6 o'clock, that's when we knew that this riot was in full sway. It was underway as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do people today know about the riot?
Oh, the people in my age group, we'll say, younger people, I don't think they know much about it, except what they were told. But you see, I was at first hand. I was a part of it. I was in the middle. I was in it. And, this was a long time ago, 21. I was 13 years old when this happened. Well, I'm now 80 years old. So you see, not many young people would know unless my age group would know about it.
Where I was.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you first, like, how old were you and where were you living? What were you doing? Let's start there.
How old was I then? This was in 1986. I was going to Tulsa University to graduate school, studying writing and video production, and very into video production. It just really sent me. I was obsessed. I just loved it. I couldn't do anything else for about 2 years except video production. It was just great. I would shoot and then I would edit, and I would shoot and then I would edit. And one of the classes that I went to was a blacklit class taught by Dr. Susan Parr, who was the dean. And she passed out an assignment that was going to be the big assignment for the year. There were a list of choices. And one of the choices on the list was the Tulsa riots. And I can remember at the time looking at that going, Tulsa riots? What Tulsa riots? I'm living in Tulsa. I've lived in Tulsa. I've never heard anything about riots. And that's what started the whole thing.
Wow.
I haven't answered this question how old I was. Somebody needs to do the math there. 86 minus 52 is what, 34? Would I have been just about your age?
Yeah. So the question is, my next question is, was it difficult when you started researching and you picked your topic? Was it difficult to find material, information on the riots? Where'd you start first? Where'd you go?
Well, the first thing I did was I went over to the library and I went to the newspapers of the time, started scrolling through the microfiche, and oddly enough, those newspapers from just those days weren't there. They'd been deleted.
Wow. Hidden, buried, and concealing.
So
at Pluto.
it took quite a bit of digging actually to find anything. There was one book at the time. I did get a hold of the book that had been written about it. And I'm not even sure how the information came to me, but I started receiving Xerox copies of the deleted newspapers.
Wow. And what did you ask when you were going to the library and different places? Did you ask people about it, and were people kind of hush hush in the town, or?
Well, nobody knew anything. Everybody was like, "Oh, we don't know what you're talking about."
Wow. Look at that.
And I was in the university, so that was basically where I was doing my research. I barely did anything except go to the university and go home. Go to the university, do video.
Yeah.
Video.
Yeah. And where were you living? I think were you on campus or?
Okay, well, so Tulsa University was a private university, and most of the people that were in my class were very much younger than me and white and rich. They would say things like, "Oh, I wrecked my car, but it's okay because my grandmother got me another one." Or, "I don't really want to work. I think I'll get a PhD."
Get out of town. It doesn't sound too far off.
So interesting in the archetype class. Winston Weathers, who was a very famous guy that wrote a bunch of books and everything, he was an old guy.
Mhm.
And he said to the class, "You are the intellectual elite of the world. Nobody has the command of their own language that you do." And I was so shocked and appalled. I can remember going home and thinking about that all week and going back and challenging him and saying, I don't really quite believe that and agree with that because, for example, in Nicaragua, they formed neighborhood literacy brigades so that neighborhood by neighborhood, they would set it up so that people could learn to read and write.
Right.
I can remember saying to him, and if I was Black, my grandmother would not have been allowed to read and write. It was illegal. So how can that be that now we're it was just, but he, of course, was very convinced of his own opinion.
I imagine as a
There was no discussion of that at all.
yeah. So
But that was the school. I'm going to school there, and then I'm going home. And at the time, in most of my life, having been disabled, I was low income, and so I was living in the housing authority, low income high rise, 11-story high rise, and everybody there that I could see, except for myself, was Black and over 65, which turned out to be an excellent resource for the Black lit class. I can remember when the subject was signifying, everybody was like, "What is signifying?" And I stepped into the elevator and there were a bunch of people in there and I go, "So, hey, what's signifying?" And between floor 1 and floor 9 where I lived, I got about 20 examples showed to me.
that's great.
So it was a very surrealistic experience to live there and to go to school, so that it was like two entirely different populations, neither of which I was part of. I was like a stranger in a strange land in both situations.
Wow. And you, for the most part, most of your life, you've kind of teetered that line of being able to like intersect and just being in a strange land and being able to kind of feel like the nomad, rather, or the wanderer, or
Absolutely. I always traveled and adventured and um, was interested in people different than myself, people other than myself. And I was very lucky in traveling. Many things happened to me, like I was traveling cross country somewhere and had a layover in Chicago for a few hours, and I was just hanging out on the street, just gonna kill a few hours. And a person came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just laying over on the bus." And she said, "Well, come on over to my mama's house. You can stay over there." That was always very good to me. And I was considered that was my Jupiter in the first house, being open to the universe.
traveling mercies
Yeah,
and a comfortable place to stay.
yes.
That's wonderful.
So I always was open to opportunities that the universe offered me.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about this. When I know you don't really recall how you came across the person you interviewed, but Mr. Julius Williams. Tell me a little bit about just what you remember about him, his nature, his just anything.
Well, he was very patient. It took me a long time to get the sound right. I was the videographer, so I was at the time dealing with the lights and the cameras and the sound, and I had an all-black video crew because I felt like that was more sensitive to the subject matter and also to the person. But I was basically responsible for all the technical part of making it happen. And he was just very patient and very kind.
That's
Uh,
great.
and it's interesting to me now that I was not more curious about him at the time, because usually I am curious about people and I want to know what their job is and who they live with and what they've done in their life. And I don't think that I asked him any of that because I was so preoccupied with making sure the sound was right and the light was right, the cameras were on, and everything was going like it's supposed to.
Yeah. Well, let's get into. Tell me a little bit about his church and some of the things he shared with you, and we will include a lot of some of those clips, especially. But um, the church.
Well, let's say it this way. For the longest time, I had that stuff in the basement. And you kept saying, well, when are you going to do something with that? When are you going to get it out? What are you going to do? And I couldn't quite get into thinking about what I was going to do with it or what to do next. It's just I had lost the original footage of the narrator and the original script that I had written that was a documentary about Greenwood. After this time listening to the footage again, I realized that he had his own story to tell. And as a documentary cinematographer, I think it's important to be neutral and to let the person tell their story, as opposed to try to take my story and shove him into it. And so this is a recent realization that I understood what his story was and what the story was that he wanted to be told out of this whole experience. And that was about the church.
Yeah. That's the Mount Zion Baptist Church that was there in Tulsa.
It took
And
him 30 years to get the money to build it.
wow.
The congregation had met and he talked about, see, the thing about Tulsa at that time, Black Tulsa was called Black Wall Street, and it was very prosperous. They had, and this is interesting to hear him talk about, that they never had to go over to the other side for anything. They were a
Wow.
completely self-sufficient city in themselves. They had hospital, they had schools, they had churches, they had businesses,
Movie
they had a
theaters.
world-class brain surgeon that lived there. This was a real mecca for Black people.
Yeah.
And one of the real highlights in the history of Black people in this country to have attained that kind of economic self-sufficiency.
Right.
And
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, especially considering the powers that be continuously pulling them down the ladder rung in other areas of the country at the time.
yeah, and Oklahoma, since they had been a territory, I suppose they were not as steeped in the tradition of the plantation and all of that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
it was kind of a more open air opportunity, I would think, for these Black towns to actually settle and form. And Toni Morrison actually wrote a book of Oklahoma. One of her books is about one of the Black towns in Oklahoma. So he talked about how it was living there, and that the congregation of the church was very devoted, and in the nature of that Capricorn, they started out in a schoolhouse and over time managed to raise $42,000 and build themselves a church. And when he described it, he was so in awe of the beautiful edifice, as he calls it, that after all of that time, after working together and raising the money and getting the church built, well, the church actually cost $92,000, and they only raised $42,000. So they got a loan for $50,000, and they built the church. And
These within the church coming together, pulling all this money together in the community, I imagine these people that are congregation members putting their life savings, some of them, into
great expense for themselves.
Yeah.
They invested a lot of money and time. And after their first meeting, they had 3 weeks.
To have it then completely decimated through the obliteration of their town, it kind of makes me think of this Dylan Roof shooter guy who walks into a Black church and just opens fire. More recently, I think in the last year or two here in the U.S. And the place like a sacred space of worship, for people of color, for Black people, especially in this country. It's the thing that they treasure the most, and it's most sacred to them. In many instances, I think that coming from or stemming from the times of slavery, when Sunday was probably a day of rest in some places, and where they could feel free and be free and praise and worship and
meet and talk to each other and be together.
Right, and feel like something or somebody. And so
and it was basically the church community that took care of the community.
Yeah.
When Black people were killed, they were just put by the side of the road, and the Black churches developed these organizations and funds to give them proper burial.
Right. Wow. And so did he, he kind of elaborated in some of the interview about his family and his experience before the riots. And so, do you recall anything specifically about, his upbringing in Tulsa?
That's what I didn't ask him about at the time, because
Right.
I was so focused on the fact of the massacre.
Right.
That I completely, between that and making the video camera work and making sure I got the sound right, I didn't even ask him what his father did. He was 13 at the time. And one of the video clips says it was a long time ago. I was 13 at the time, and I'm 80 years old now.
Wow. Okay, I'm just pulling up a couple more things here, facts that I wanted to ask you about. So days later, now we're going to get to the chart of the riots here in a second. I'm going to put that up on the screen. Um, let's see here.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later, Tulsa race riot. Here it is.
So basically, in the rest of the country in 1919,
Mm-hmm.
36 different cities had similar massacres where when the black soldiers came home from war and wanted jobs and education and a welcome home like everybody else was getting,
Instead, they got a war.
the white people were so disturbed by this. In every instance, it says it was started by a false rumor, that there was no violence on the part of the black people, that it was completely mobs of white people that would go over where the black people were living and loot and burn and kill.
Wow.
36 cities in this country in 1919. And that is something we never read about in history books.
Never. This is my first time hearing it. I've seen it, instances of it in Hollywood film, where the soldier would come from war and they, tell him, "Oh, you get in the back of the bus, boy," and he's just traveling home from war to back to his family, and still does not have the respect and honored as, the same people he fought next to. Hmm? Sorry?
His comrades.
Yeah, his comrades. I remember a long time ago hearing a story about soldiers talking about not being able to share the water fountain here, yet in the war they were, on the battlefield everyone was drinking from the same containers, and it's just kind of to have that shattering world reality. Hmm?
That's saving each other's lives.
Yeah. Can you say that again? I think we lost audio.
And saving each other's lives.
Right, and saving each other's lives. The value of a person's life off this soil. And that kind of brings us to a lot of our work that has been uh, kind of enclosed in locality, astrocartography, the soil, the land, and how people respond to their environment based on the date things were established, based, if someone were to start a store or a business, how people would within that business walk in and be transformed or engage or interact in that shop or that business. I think it kind of applies to a lot of the soil, the US's whole Pluto opposition Mercury. Um, Everyone has to press down a secret, is what it seems, playing out over and over again. So I'm going to share the screen of the Tulsa riots here.
And on that, if you were a person who were an astrologer at the time and you saw the chart of this country and you saw that Tulsa had a conjunction had opposition to the sun of the country, and that the Pluto of this country was on the sun of Tulsa, would you think that would be a good place to live?
Right. Not at all.
No. Something not happened.
Right. So here we have the Tulsa riots. I have two dates because I know the sort of buzz of it all, May 31st, 1921. And then we have June.
First was the day that the newspaper published a rumor, and this was the rumor that started the massacre in 36 other cities, oddly enough. oddly enough, that a black man had molested a white woman.
Right. And a
And
rumor.
the real story was Dick Rowland, who was working in downtown Tulsa, wanted to go to the bathroom. Now, how is this coming around again that bathrooms are such a problem for people? It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And there was only one place in downtown Tulsa that black people could go to the bathroom. And so he was going to go there. To go there, he had to get on the elevator. And while he was on the elevator, something happened or didn't happen. And that became the rumor that then the newspaper published, and white mobs began to gather on the courthouse steps, calling for lynching.
Wow. Unreal.
And in each of these cases, these rumors were found to be untrue.
Absolutely. And that sounds like Mercury opposition Pluto.
Uh,
So,
and also, Sun conjunct Jupiter with that exaggeration.
yeah.
It's
Let me make
getting big and out of hand.
let me make sure I pull up the other chart as well so people can
June
see
1st was the
the June
actual
1st.
day that. So May 31st was the day that the incident happened on the elevator and the courthouse steps and the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't actually know this, the details of this, until I listened to Mr. Wilson talking again, and he described the chronology of what happened in his life. And then I made sense of the actual chronology of the thing. Because in the information, it says that the Tulsa Massacre was on May 31st, but in fact, it was not until the 1st of June.
Right. But the rumor itself, the seed that sparked
The trigger that started the whole thing.
Right. That's significant as well to look at that
Yeah.
in synastry with the city of Tulsa. So this here is, let's back up a little bit. Go to the chart of May 31st and let's see, what we can pull from it, because 10 p.m. is a time that we have. And I wanted to touch on, when you were doing all your research, you mentioned some audio that you listened to that was
Like,
so,
it had been the next day.
right. It was so alarming that it gave you kind of like terrors.
Oh, yeah.
To hear people screaming and running.
By the time I got into this information, I was dreaming about it. And the high rise that I was living in was actually up on the hill above the Greenwood neighborhood. And that is one of the places that they put a machine gun and shot down at the Greenwood neighborhood.
So tell me again now, who put a machine gun on the hill?
Oh, nobody knows. Somebody did.
Somebody did.
It was a coordinated effort. What they did was ultimately they had organized 10,000 white people to go over to where the black people were living and they had apparently airplanes flying over, dropping fire bombs. They set the houses on fire as the people ran out. They shot them. And then they had trucks where they loaded up all their stuff. And they went house to house, neighborhood to neighborhood, and did this. 45 blocks. 45
Wow.
city blocks, completely burned to the ground by the end of the day.
Wow. And here's the rumor. Here's the Pluto conjunct Mercury in Cancer on May 31st. And as we get closer, we see June 1st, we'll see the next chart in a second here.
Well, wait a minute, look at that, Mars and Sun.
Yeah.
And
Mars square to Saturn.
Yeah, and Uranus at T-square.
And so ultimately, there is a lie. There is a deceptive sort of seed planted as we look at this chart of the May 31st newspaper publication time, and think about just what's stirring, what people are talking, and people are getting afraid. People are probably starting to leave town, and within the Black community. And
Well, at one point, he says he really didn't think anything was going to happen. He said, and this is from the tape, he was at his, I guess, junior high school graduation ceremony the evening of May 31st. And the way he says this, he says, "We heard trouble was brewing uptown." And then later he says, "We really didn't believe it would happen here. We didn't think anything was going to happen."
yeah, it's impossible. But I recall hearing about people having the white people not being jealous of them, this prominent or established Black community where they had pianos and things that they did not have in their homes in the white community, and the jealousy ensuing from that. And so it's just a bitterness, um, if we look at this, I wanted to look at the moon to capture the flavor, like the emotional nature of the seed that sparked this thing. And the moon in Aries here, and we see its aspect square to Pluto in
Oh, yeah.
Capricorn. It is a destructive force, and it is a
Being
sort of,
rash, acting without thinking.
yeah, it's an impulsive, rash action of sorts. And Aries wanting to sort of be combative and be aggressive in nature. This just tells me that there was no cooling this fire. When you
Oh,
look at
yeah.
this chart,
Especially with that Mars conjunct the sun. This is such a perfect setup for bad things.
right? So then let's go into June 1st, 1921.
Right. So he said he and his family went home that night after the graduation ceremony to their house, and they went to bed. And they really didn't think anything was going to happen. But early that morning, they got up and realized that there was a problem. And so they fled to safety on June 1st. And that was the day that the organized looting and burning and shooting was taking place.
Yeah. So I'm gonna do the synastry now and just kind of look at the synastry of this actual riot, also the city.
It could have been going on overnight because at some point in the deep dark depths of the library somewhere, I got a hold of some audio recording. It was just chilling of people. It was a radio broadcast, and it had people screaming, and you could hear gunshots and explosions, and you could hear people going, "What was that?" And then screaming and running.
Wow.
Somehow I got a hold of some audio, and so it must have been the night of the 31st, and it was just that it didn't get to his part of town until early the next day, because they say that it was on June 1st that the National Guard was called in. So it must have been overnight. And right, and so when they called out the cops and the local officials and handed them guns and badges, they joined in the looting and burning and shooting.
Yeah, which is not uncommon.
And that's exactly what happened in those other 1919 massacres in 36 cities.
Wow. And just to kind of scale back, I keep going back to that Pluto Mercury opposition. It's the corruption. Mercury is the written law or written word. And so this Pluto opposition Mercury in this country, this pattern of the corruption of man-made laws, You know, no certain people follow it, and it's just kind of being bent and bowed in many ways. That's the consistent pattern here. So
Right,
in
and
this,
it's not fulfilling on the promises they're making. They're false promises. And that's the Pluto part, is that Pluto knows that they're not. That's so interesting because you see the Pluto conjunct the sun, and then with the city of Tulsa, you see the sun, or is that moon conjunct Saturn? And you know, when I heard about this, I was just so appalled, and I was like, how could people do that? How could people participate in that? How could people stand by and let that happen? Well, there it is. It's that moon conjunct Saturn.
right, and so on the inside, Will, this is the chart of Oklahoma City. And so that moon conjunct Saturn in Sagittarius tells me of like a cold philosophy. It's like
Right.
a detached
With
embrace
all of emotion and caring and feeling of
to anything foreign, to anything that's different or that is
probably
expansive.
to each other as well. I mean, really to each other. I mean, the people that we know that have moon conjunct Saturn, they don't love their mother.
No, not necessarily. No, and if they do, it's through evolved sort of age progression or
Right.
Saturnian maturity.
And their mother is distant. The mother is not caring and supportive.
Mother is cold, yeah. So Tulsa was definitely not supportive of its own the black community, its own
Right.
children, in the same way it was not supportive of the Native Americans, you know. Which so the next thing I wanted to kind of look at was some of these conjunctions and aspects to the chart of Tulsa on the inside, and then the chart of the race riots on June 1st. There, kind of pointed at that Pluto conjunct Sun, the destruction. And when I think of Gemini and a destructive force in the sign of Gemini, it is a destructive word. It's a destructive message. Um, Gemini is the neighborhood.
Right, it was a message, and the message was that those white people thought that if they burned the town down, that black people would disappear. They didn't
Right.
want them there, and they wanted them to disappear.
Gemini is the neighborhood. It's their immediate environment. And so the sun is the life force. And so Pluto says, no, let's get rid of it. Let's squash the life force. And then Neptune is not too far. The story is
Yeah, how do you like that?
Neptune says, yeah,
Um,
cover it up
right.
so that people can't even, trace it back to what really happened here. And that's what happened for a long time. The next thing I kind of noticed was um, this whole, it's a little bit wide, but the Uranus opposition to Saturn in the chart of the riot. And it sort of is like a break. It's like I would call it a constricted breakthrough in a sense that had this particular race riot, the national, I won't even say national coverage that it got, but what it did in comparison to race riots in other parts of the country, this is the one that that seems to be more prominent and people are talking about a lot more versus the other ones that happen in other parts of the nation, such as St. Louis, Bisbee, Arizona, DC, Chicago, Omaha, and Elaine. Why this one? And what do you think that Saturn opposition Uranus might have to do with that, if any?
Interesting. I guess a Uranus would be the breakthrough of the suppression of Saturn. That Saturn would not be able to effectively uh, hold back the information.
Right. Um,
It's like when we have an opposition, it's like those two planets are working at cross purposes of each other. So if Saturn is trying to maintain the order and maintain the traditional story, Uranus is going to upset that.
Yeah. So we touched on this Pluto in Gemini, but let's kind of get back to the Pluto in Cancer in of the riots opposing the Mars and Mercury of the U.S. and that whole nurturing. Where did they when they rounded up? In your interview, he mentioned that they were rounded up and taken somewhere.
Yes, the National Guard were called to restore order. The governor called out the National Guard on June 1st. And to restore order, what the National Guard did was they rounded up all the black people and put them in internment camps.
Well, isn't that history repeating itself? Because that's the same thing that happened to the Native Americans in that area. They were rounded up.
And it happened to a few other groups of people that we know about.
Yeah. And so we see Pluto as this, not just this destructive force, but I want to talk about the evolution of Pluto. When we look at astrologers such as like Jeffrey Wolf Green and stuff that talk about Pluto points, the opposition of Pluto being the Pluto point, a place of relief for your Pluto, place of remedy or neutrality, rather. What do you think is going from all this Pluto energy, Pluto on your midheaven, Pluto on my Mars, all these Pluto conjunctions, aspects, and sort of events? What is going on here, and why are we looking at Pluto specifically?
Well, because ultimately Pluto is the redeemer, right?
Right.
Pluto is the phoenix that rises from the ashes of destruction. And so Pluto is actually the truth that comes out.
The underworld, the belly, and you know, I think withstanding, time, Pluto is the one that is willing to go to and through the depths of the human psyche, of our consciousness. In this great conjunction, we talked a lot about internal systems. Saturn conjunct Pluto is our internal destruction of our inner world and breaking down systems, rather, and it being not necessarily an external event, but more an internal event.
Right.
So our hope in this, our hope in putting this material out there and looking at the astrology of the riots in Tulsa is, for me, is to make more people not just aware, but to look at their own internal system and how you're living. How is your Pluto, destroying, rebuilding, compounding, creating life force now moving forward? All of what you've destroyed and no longer serves you, there's a part of this country, there's a part of this story that you can almost feel in your bones. To me, that's Capricorn. you know I think that's the axis of this Pluto point, rather, in the story, is no one can deny, when hearing and seeing this, that it didn't happen.
Right. And that's what the commission from 2001 says is, if nothing else, no one can deny that this happened.
That's it. Let the truth ring like a gong through the city.
Pluto always gives you something new after it takes away everything you got. And part of our wanting to do this project, I think, was to ride the crest of the wave of Pluto, to get with the Pluto energy, because when you resist Pluto, when you resist giving up, whatever it is that Pluto is trying to tear down and take away that you don't really need anymore, you just make it a lot rougher on yourself.
Yeah, that's for sure. And we looked at, let's go back to the chart of Tulsa, and we looked at how Tulsa suffered.
Look at this though. What we haven't talked about here that I am now looking at, and I'm not sure how close this is there's a big Grand Cross there.
Yes, there is. And here's, for the people watching, this is the Grand Cross here between the Chiron moon and Jupiter, the Saturn, this stellium here in Sagittarius, opposing here this stellium in Gemini. So there's a grand Well,
And not only that, but you've got, what is that?
it's not exactly. Um, there's a little bit of a cardinal cross, you know,
There's also a mutable
mutable
thing
cross. Yeah.
with the opposition of the sun and Pluto opposed to the cold-hearted moon, Saturn, and then squared to Jupiter on one side and Uranus on the other.
Yeah.
And
And
beautiful times.
yeah. You know, we talked about, I think you'd looked at the literacy rate in Tulsa at one point through this research project. And did you discover,
It's current. Yeah, the current literacy rate in Tulsa, in the state of Oklahoma, they're like number 48 or something literacy right now in this country.
and, and it's if you look at again the chart of Oklahoma City, Tulsa here.
Tulsa, not Oklahoma City.
Yeah,
Oklahoma City
Tulsa
is a
City.
city in
Right.
itself. So we can't talk about them. They have their own thing.
They got their own issues.
They really do.
Yeah, so the chart of Tulsa City, Oklahoma here on the inside. And I think we kind of looked at a little bit of where the karmic backlog came into play from this city suffering from the events of this race riot. If you're suppressing information related to the riot, then what else are you suppressing and creating a delay in resources and education and stuff like that? I
Right.
can't.
In fact, part of the aftermath for the city of Tulsa would be like delayed development.
Right. And that's here. We can see in the axis of education, the Gemini component here. So I imagine, you know, in comparison to the rest of this country, you know, Tulsa having this issue, well, just imagine if we look at things, we do a lot of work around releasing and catharsis, releasing things. If this city were to dedicate a day to honoring the family members or the people who died, and versus just saying we can't deny it, that's all we can do. But if there were days to honor the events of these riots, especially, what this might do to release some of the toxic, pattern here. Sometimes history just wants to heal through, I think that's a lot of why this city is suffering the way
You
it is.
can't heal from what you don't know.
Right.
It's still there in your psyche. But if you don't release it and grapple with it and acknowledge it, it's not going to let you go.
Right. And that leads us into the chart of the U.S. as we're kind of wrapping this up here. The U.S., let's put it up here, Declaration. What it is refusing to sort of admit and share.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the church.
Well, we don't have the church. I definitely will talk. We can talk about it. I don't have the chart or information of the church, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to say anything you wanted to share about that.
Okay.
I just wanted to do our last chart so I could stop to share. The chart of the United States, the whole you can't heal from what you don't
Right.
know and what you don't share and talk about.
It's knowledge. And it's that whole suppression, all the suppression
Of family secrets.
So much energy to keep those secrets under wraps.
Yeah.
And so that completely siphons off the energy that you would be using then to evolve.
Well, and consider looking at the U.S., the images in the media that the United States has worked so hard to present to the American population of Africa. It's always like children with flies on their face, and all these. They never have positive images of Black people and where they come from. And the one dedicated month of Black history always focuses on the same like 20 people historically, and so the U.S. getting into the real heroes are some of these people that. For one, the gentleman you interviewed, Mr. Julius Williams, the people that have shared the story of the truth and are continuing to do so, the red zoning, the people who talked about red zoning in different parts of this country and that are still doing work, like Dr. Susan Parr, your professor, who is still continuing to do this work to share this knowledge with amongst her counterparts.
And
So,
we're talking about Pluto at a time that Pluto is very much of interest. And in fact, the story of Mount Zion Baptist Church is the story of Pluto, an example of what happens with Pluto, because here these people for 30 years saved up their money and planned and built the church and met in the church. And 3 weeks later, it was burned to the ground. Everything was burned to the ground. The hospitals, the schools, many churches were burned to the ground. And those people had taken out a loan for $50,000. And it took them until, 19, it took them another 10 or 15 years to finish paying off that loan on a church that was ashes.
wow.
And they did it. And then they raised the money and they built another church, which opened in 1952? So that's Pluto, that ability to be reborn from the ashes. That Pluto represents the true heart of the community, of the people that didn't die.
Wow.
And if you put up that picture of the current Mount Zion Church,
Yeah, I'll do that.
it's about 6 feet from the freeway.
Wow, the freeway that was built to run the black people out of
Through
there.
the middle of the Greenwood area to prevent Greenwood from being rebuilt again. Mr. Williams talks about how his house, his family house on Hartford, is right about where the freeway is right now. And so by building that freeway right through the Greenwood area, nobody says it was a deliberate attempt to suppress and prevent Greenwood from rebuilding, but it certainly served that purpose. Mr.
Right.
Wilson wanted to tell was of his congregation and their faith being able to be destroyed and prevail.
Yeah.
And once again, come back together and build their church. And if that isn't the story of Pluto, I don't know what is.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And it makes me think of the consistency of Capricorn, Tulsa City, Oklahoma, having that stellium in Capricorn, and desiring that sort of something long withstanding.
Right, and just continuing to work at it and continuing to hold your dream and hold your ambition.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, my four winds. I think we have everything.
Well, thank you so much for keeping this out of my basement. Well, that opposition is not real close, but it has Sun opposition to Pluto. And that's the thing that we're watching in this whole event, is where Pluto is. And Pluto now is right there. It's in the same place.
Right, and especially this Pluto opposition Mercury, I imagine here as well, a whole lot of, things that need to be said coming out here through this axis.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So Mercury opposition Pluto, what do you get from that?
Well, to me, it's a secret. It's holding a deep, dark secret, and then the retrograde is something that is delayed. It comes out over time, and even when it does come out, you get a little piece, and you have to put it together. And so that's kind of a lot of what our work has been through delineation and unraveling this chart of the U.S. and how it applies to our lives and presently. But how about you? You know, you're someone born with Pluto conjunct Mercury, and your capacity to research and find information is sort of remarkable. So the U.S. here on in opposition, creating a balancing point or balancing beam, rather. How do you?
That is very interesting, isn't it?
Mhm.
And that Mercury is conjunct to my sun.
Yeah,
The Mercury in the chart of the United States. That would mean that my sun would activate that Mercury. So
exactly.
my sun, in opposition to Pluto, currently in my midheaven, is speaking the secrets of this country.
Yeah, and so this kind of leads us into um, what happens with Cancer. You know, Cancer, the natural fourth house of home and family and roots and heritage, conditioning. You know, what happens when the the family secrets come out? You know, is
Yeah,
there?
there's a lot of that going on right now with this Pluto thing
Mhm.
happening currently.
It
There are
sends a
a lot-
shockwave. Yeah. Pluto is a shocking sort of. I think of it as something crawling out of the depths of a basement, or like a moldy basement that no one has, you know, kind of cared for or tended to, and all you can do is destroy it, expose it, in order to deal and heal, you know, from it.
And there's
So
so much power in, there's so much stress and power in the holding the secret.
exactly, and that's the control. Pluto's. We know that Pluto, when expressing itself in its lowest form, is manipulation, control, and destructive force.
And just ultimate power.
Yeah. So we
So
kind
would
of,
that, so would we say then that by sign, but not by exact, that the chart of the United States then it is having opposition with its own power.
absolutely by sign, um, most definitely, and again with that Mercury by degree, this this great conjunction that's, you know, just kind of happened on January 12th here at 22 degrees in Capricorn, um, forming a close opposition to the Mercury of the United States. Well, you know, this is why some of this project is sort of coming to life at this time.
Yeah,
It often
that
takes,
would happen.
yeah, it often takes a major transit like this for someone to dig up things in the cemetery that may not have had a gravestone. So um, I would like to kind of go on from the chart of the U.S. unless there's something else in here.
Oh,
I
that's
don't.
a good start.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
You know what we missed though? We should have had the World War, the First World War chart,
Mm,
because that was one of the events that precipitated what's coming next.
right.
And put that on the chart of the United States. So, there's always more, isn't there?
There you go. Always. So then I wanted to get into Tulsa City, Oklahoma, and then we'll cast the synastry as well. January 18th, 1898. Um, and so it looks to me like Tulsa is a Capricorn city, 28 degrees in Capricorn. Tulsa
That's
has a,
Capricorn.
yeah, a lot of stellium there.
Yeah,
And
that the sun of Tulsa would be on the Pluto of the country,
right,
and the
this,
nodes are there as well. So it's a karmic unraveling between them.
absolutely. The life force of Tulsa, kind of the being destroyed rather by the secret of the United States. I also noted the Venus at 21 degrees in Capricorn, and how when we look back at the chart of the U.S., you know, that Mercury opposition to this Venus at 21 Capricorn,
Oh yeah,
the node of Tulsa, which has a Sun conjunct Rahu or Sun conjunct node, the node of Tulsa is also conjunct that um, Pluto as well.
yes.
And so if we know anything about, you know, the nodes from a Eastern astrological perspective, we know that the nodes relate to sort of illusions and deception, and or rather, the North Node, Rahu, relates to a little bit of illusion and deception, and just this desire to attain. Um,
Well, in knowing no bounds, the
yeah,
thing that we've recently found about Rahu is that it's like this appetite that can never be quenched.
satiated. Yeah, and it's an insatiable quench for something, and for very focused with like rose-colored glasses or a virtual reality headset on this thing that's not real. So that being said, Tulsa being a Capricorn city, stellium in Capricorn, that looks to me like a pretty, status building, wealthy economy. It would sound like, somewhere that would be self-sufficient in many ways. If you think about the archetype of Capricorn.
Well, it likes to think that it was the oil capital.
And we know that this country loves loves its black gold, right?
Yes.
So, um,
So let's talk a little bit about what happened in Oklahoma before Tulsa was formed, as Tulsa was forming.